a large part of the recent increase, it is North America that remains the outlier. China, the rest of East Asia, Russia, Europe, and other large industrialized regions produce roughly similar quantities of greenhouse gases per capita, about 8 to 10 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Most countries of the global south produce from half to a quarter of that quantity per person, and some far less. The United States and Canada, on the other hand, consume around 20 tons per person per year, or double the amount of other large industrialized countries. Organized by country, these per capita figures conceal another inequality. Today, the disparity in emissions lies not only between countries and regions, but, increasingly, within them. In most regions of the world, the top 10% of the population by income is responsible for more than 3/4 of the carbon emissions. The bottom 50% of the population of North America, for example, produces less than 1/6 of the emissions per person of the top 10%. The ratio in Europe is similar. In both regions, over the 3 decades from 1990 to 2019, those in the poorest half of the population appear to have reduced their per capita emissions by 25 to 30%, probably due to their decreased wages and consumption combined with the effect of national climate policies. As a result, that half of the population in both regions is already on course to meet the 2030 per capita emissions targets compatible with 1.5 degrees of warming. The richest 10%, on the other hand, would have to reduce their contribution to emissions by more than 80% to reach the same benchmark. The challenge facing democratic politics today appears to be an inability to take into account the interests of future generations, or even of the near future. The obstacle is particularly marked in the United States, which combines the highest levels of per capita consumption of fossil fuels among large industrialized countries with historically the greatest intransigence towards the transition away from their use. And this, in turn, is combined with increasing inequality, in which a privileged minority of the population accounts for an ever greater share of that excess, and for the accompanying intransigence. How does the understanding of energy politics developed in carbon democracy help us think about the present challenge? Let me recap certain themes from the book. A first step is to avoid the problem of energy determinism, where the expanding consumption of fossil fuels is explained as an inevitable aspect of the long development of industrial society. Not only was very little excess carbon generated before the 1960s, compared to what has been produced since, but the extraordinary quantities of oil and gas the West has consumed since then was not something on which it depended as a natural feature of its industrial life. Those carbon-heavy ways of living were engineered in the design of overweight vehicles, the car-centered layout of cities and suburbs, inefficient standards for the use of energy in buildings, the reliance on synthetic chemicals and heavy machinery in farming, and other paths that were adopted partly to develop and sustain an excessive consumption of hydrocarbons. The latest threat to the dependence of the West on fossil fuels, the cutting of gas supplies to Europe in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, illustrates the engineered form of this dependence. While the interruption to supplies caused considerable short-term hardship, especially in countries such as Britain, where the government refused to manage the shortage, Europe quickly adapted to alternative supplies. It was predicted that in the following year alone, the generation of power from renewables would increase by 20%. Second, oil politics involved not just creating this dependence on carbon-based energy. The dependence was itself a means of weakening demands for more democratic and less unequal societies. The book explores this by drawing a historical comparison between coal and oil. Surprisingly, while oil can be associated with the weakening of democracy, dependence on coal seemed not to be an impediment to democratic politics, but the factor that made mass democracy itself possible. This happened not simply because, as historians have argued, coal fueled an industrial revolution, creating new social forces that fought for improvements in collective life, but for a more specific reason. The widespread use of coal, and especially its use to generate electricity, created countries almost